Good evening, and welcome to this inaugural Denis Showalter Memorial Lecture. For those of you who might not know me, my name is Jessica Meyer, and I'm president of the International Society for First World War Studies, and it gives me huge pleasure to welcome you here this evening, either in person or online. It's a huge privilege to be able to introduce this, the first of what we at the International Society for First World War Studies hope will be a run of many years of lectures in celebration of the memory of one of the great scholars in our field. The author of 28 books and many, many other publications, Denis Showalter was one of the foremost scholars in military history, specializing in German military history from the Wars of Unification to the 20th century. He earned the Birdsall Prize in 1992 from the American Historical Association for his book Tannenberg, the Society for Military History's Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize in 2005 for his lifetime contribution to military history, and the 2018 Pritzker Literature Award for Lifetime Achievement in Military Writing. As well as an outstanding scholar, Denis was a much-loved teacher, teaching at Colorado College for 47 years, where he was known and loved by students well beyond those majoring in history, as I know because my sister was a student there and has memories of him. He served as visiting professor at the United States Army Military Academy, the United States Air Force Academy, the Marine Corps University, and Norwich University's Masters in Military History program, and acted as advising fellow to the University of Texas Bersanti Military History Center, where he advised and mentored doctoral candidates. It's for this dedication to mentoring and supporting emerging scholars that Denis will be best remembered, particularly by this society. Dr. Jenny MacLeod, founding secretary and treasurer for the society, recalls that when she and Dr. Pierre Perseg, the founding president, organized the first conference of what was to become the International Society, they were respectively a precariously employed research fellow and a PhD student. She writes, "We put out a call for papers to postgraduates and postdocs, I think, via HNet. Among all the responses was one from Denis, who humbly submitted his paper proposal alongside those postgrads, etc., enclosing a CV as requested. Whereas most people's CVs were about 2 pages, Denis's went on and on and on. In my memory, about 10 pages of his publication lists. It was a mark of his scholarship and his eagerness to engage with new scholars without airs and graces. He was one of a handful of established academics who traveled on his own expense, or his institutions, to Lyon to take a chance on a couple of kids and the conference we pulled together on A Wing and a Prayer. At a later conference in Oxford, he once again demonstrated this eagerness to engage in accepting and responding to Heather Jones' comments on his paper. Heather, who is now an established professor in the field, was at the time just starting her PhD. It remains a shining example of the intergenerational exchange that Denis sought to foster in the society as elsewhere. Denis went on to become a founder member of the Society, which emerged from the Lyon Conference, and a longtime member of the Board of Directors, where he set the tone for the entire enterprise through his unwavering belief in and support of one of the Society's central tenets of bringing together emerging and established scholars in the field of First World War studies in a relationship of mentoring, support, and dialogue that is both scholarly and engaging. He was also a supporter of another aspect of the Society's mission to develop the field of First World War studies as an interdisciplinary endeavor, which can only reach its full potential where military, social, and cultural historians engage with each other and with scholars in other fields, and above all with the wider public. Everyone who encountered Denis will have a story of his immense enthusiasm and generosity. Pierre reminded me of the time he broke into a First World War Polish song he knew to illustrate a comment that he was making at the conference in Georgetown in 2007, a song that he had apparently learned from his grandmother. One of my treasured memories is of a tea break at the 2013 conference in Paris, where over exquisite patisserie, Denis explained in detail why I, as a historian of both wartime medical care provision and detective fiction, had to read Jacqueline Winspear's Maisie Dodds novels. That he should spend so much time discussing the specific research interests of a still relatively unestablished scholar, as I was then, and that he should be so knowledgeable about areas of the field all too often deemed not proper military history, was entirely typical. That conversation gave me the courage to pursue my interest in the relationship between detective fiction and the war in a way that nothing else could. Mine is only one of thousands of similar stories of support and encouragement that Denis has been the protagonist in over the years. It feels only right, therefore, that we should honour the memory of the contribution that he made to this society through providing emerging scholars with the opportunity to present their research in the form of a public lecture. These lectures, which will not only be live streamed, but also made available on the Society's YouTube channel and published in the Society's journal, First World War Studies, will be an annual event, and I'm delighted to say that the nominations for the 2022 lecture are, as of today, open. Please visit the Society website, firstworldwarstudies.org, to download details about how to nominate a candidate for consideration. Nominations close on the 1st of May, with the announcement of the award and full details on the lecture itself taking place later in the year. In the meantime, I'm delighted that this evening we will be hearing from Dr. Shamragni Banerjee on the care of Indian servicemen in the First World War. The Society is very grateful to Northumbria University for hosting the event, and particularly to Dr. Anne-Marie Einhaus and to Ruth Davey, who have worked tirelessly to make this event possible. We are extremely indebted to Ruth, who has dealt with the administration attendant on the double change of date for this lecture. So thank you very much, Ruth. I won't keep you any longer from Dr. Banerjee's lecture, which will, I am sure, reflect the essential qualities which Denis brought to the Society: excellent scholarship, interdisciplinarity, intellectual curiosity, and generous engagement with all. It is a fitting tribute to a man who was always, to quote Jenny again, hugely knowledgeable and scholarly, of course, but also unstuffy, generous, kind, and fun. Denis is and will be very much missed. Thank you.
Hello, and a very warm welcome also on behalf of Northumbria University. I'm Anne-Marie Einhaus, and I'm currently the Director of Research for English Language, Literature and Creative Writing here at Northumbria, and also a long-time member of the International Society for First World War Studies. And I'm absolutely delighted in that sense that we're able to host this lecture tonight. It gives me great pleasure also to introduce the inaugural Denis Showalter Memorial Lecturer, Dr. Shamragni Banerjee. I think one would really be hard-pressed to find a more impressive or a more dedicated early career scholar in the field of First World War studies than Dr. Banerjee, who I can see blushing over there, who has given so much time and energy to promoting research and networking in the field by contributing to conference organization, peer review, and public engagement. In 2018, she was an invited discussant for the BBC and UK Department of Education Great War debate on First World War medicine, surgery, and treatment. In 2019, Dr. Banerjee both co-organized the conference The First World War Past, Present, Future at Edinburgh Napier University and served on the conference committee of the International Society for First World War Studies Conference Legacies of the First World War at the University of Leeds, which I think for quite a few of us was probably the last in-person pre-pandemic conference we attended, certainly for me. For her significant contributions to the field, she was in fact elected a Fellow of the International Society in 2020. Dr. Banerjee completed her doctorate funded by a Vice-Chancellor Scholarship at the University of Sheffield in 2018. Her PhD thesis, Nursing Politics and the Body in First World War Life Writing, examined the life writings of trained and volunteer Anglophone nurses of the First World War, and was praised by her examiners for being original and groundbreaking because it uncovered a curious silence in secondary scholarship about the treatment of non-white soldiers, despite the substantial critical work on the treatment of white soldiers. Since 2018, she has secured a prestigious Wellcome Trust Fellowship at the University of Leeds and is now, to our great delight, a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the Department of Humanities at Northumbria. Dr. Bonerjee is also a visiting scholar at the Oxford Centre for Life Writing, and her Wellcome-funded research revealed how First World War colonial medical care was laced with racial tropes of othering, and it lays the groundwork for her current Leverhulme Fellowship entitled Imperial Politics and Medical Care 1915 to 1925. Her new project, from which material for tonight's lecture is drawn, and I should say early material because she's only just started her fellowship, will examine how the colonial care provider encountered and negotiated the plurality of identities, race, ethnicity, class, caste, and religion of their colonized patients in war hospital settings. Dr. Bonerjee's research will analyze how such care was experienced and represented in the writings of medical personnel and patients. In previous postdoctoral research, Dr. Bonerjee focused on First World War colonial court-martial and discovered archival records of court-martial proceedings for Indian soldiers not following due process, using necropolitics as a methodological tool to understand the power wielded by the colonial state over the lives of colonized soldiers. In sum, Dr. Bonerjee's research and her substantial publications on the First World War, colonialism, and medical humanities, including 2 forthcoming edited volumes of essays and numerous articles and book chapters, challenge the assumptions of the Eurocentric archive of First World War literature and demonstrate her ability to produce original and productive research. Dr. Bonerjee's research lies at the intersection of race, medical care, and biopower in First World War culture, and contributes to highly topical concerns around decolonizing our understanding of the war and its longer-term impact. And I will now hand over to Dr. Bonerjee herself and hope you enjoy learning more about her fascinating work, particularly at a time where war, unfortunately, is once again intruding into our everyday lives. And I'd just like to close my introduction by also very much thanking the International Society for making this possible, and Ruth Davey and her team for helping us get this event off the ground despite some scheduling challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that very, very generous introduction, Anne-Marie. Before I start today's talk, I'd just like to talk about this very brief memory I have of Professor Dennis Showalter. In 2015, I was a first-year PhD student in English literature on my way to my first conference as a PhD student in Italy, and it was a completely new format by this International Society for First World War Studies, and I had never presented a paper like that. I had to send my paper off in advance. It was then going to be commented upon by some senior scholar. I was absolutely terrified, and it turned out that I was also the first speaker on the very first day. I survived my session, and it was in Trento. And I remember over lunch, lots of senior colleagues, professors, actually sought me out and talked to me. And one of them was actually Dennis. And one of my enduring memories of him is he was just so funny. I don't think he actually listened to my paper. He did kind of have a habit, I think, of falling asleep during the actual presentation, but then he would kind of wake up during the Q&A and ask a very generous kind of question, and that was it. And here we are today. Right, so that was my only memory of him, unfortunately. In 1914, the colour bar was lifted on the recruitment of soldiers of colour to fight for Britain in the British Armed Forces during the First World War. While the colour bar was reintroduced and lifted several times in the following years until the end of the Second World War, millions of combatants and non-combatants of colour from the British Empire served the British in near and distant wars. During the First World War, as these personnel of color got wounded or sick, strict colonial regulations controlled their access to medical treatment based on race, which were captured in official documents. The experience of medical care for wounded or sick Indian soldiers varied from one front to the other. The bulk of official documents produced focused on access and nature of care on the Western Front. These documents and letters were primarily exchanged between Lord Hardinge, the Viceroy of India, the Marquess of Crewe, the Secretary of State for India, Sir Walter Lawrence, Commissioner in charge of the welfare of Indian troops, and Lord Kitchener, Secretary of State for War. The policies relating to healthcare in the Mesopotamian front were less elaborately formulated. Following Britain's disastrous Mesopotamian campaign, 2 commissions were appointed to investigate the healthcare policies: the Vincent Bingley Commission, created in March 1916, and the Mesopotamia Commission, created in July 1916. In lieu of the absence of formal policy documents or letters, these commission reports stand to give us an idea of the care measures that had been in place at this particular front. Access to healthcare is a fundamental human right, yet it continues to be one of the most complicated and politicized processes designed by imperial power structures and adversely affecting the most marginalized in society. Over the course of this talk, I will consider how necropolitical states exert power to control access to and mode of medical care. My understanding of necropolitical state comes from Achille Mbembe's theory of necropolitics. Mbembe defines a necropolitical state as a sovereign state whose ultimate expression of sovereignty largely resides in the power and capacity to dictate who is able to live and who must die. I will consider the example of Indian soldiers fighting for the British during the First World War as a case study to understand unequal structures of power. Close reading these official documents offer an insight into how policies related to medical care for personnel of color, here Indian soldiers, were drafted, the conditions and processes in which such laws were formulated. Close reading letters exchanged between men of power reveal the thought processes and debates that led them to make decisions on who should live and who should die. What collective discussions led to the formalizing of procedures that managed and policed wounded or sick personnel of color? These documents reveal an anxiety about cross-racial contact and outline detailed measures to avoid the possibility of such contact. However, these powerful men often couched their wording in careful rhetoric to avoid an admission of refusal to comply with British government policy. The official British government position at the outbreak of war was to oppose arbitrary actions based on race and to make sure that they appeared to acknowledge gratitude and dispense justice to Indian troops for volunteering to lay down their lives in a war that had nothing to do with them. Approaching that position with skepticism, I will read official documents against the grain to uncover how colonial healthcare policies enact colonial governance even in war hospital settings. Analyzing particular excerpts from these documents, I will urge for an affective understanding of the colonial and racial power structures and the marginalized person of color's right to access healthcare. For the first few months after the outbreak of war, the precise location of war hospitals and the means of care for wounded Indian soldiers preoccupied the bulk of the correspondence exchanged between Crewe and Hardinge. In a letter to Hardinge on the 16th of October 1914, Crewe complained about the refusal of French authorities to accommodate wounded Indian soldiers at hospitals in France or in French colonial territories in North Africa. A quote from this letter. Talking of the wounded, a change of plan concerning the Indian base is giving a great deal of trouble. I was greatly pleased by the proposed system of taking Indian wounded by train to Marseille allowing some to recuperate in the south of France and taking others direct to Egypt. But the arrangements in France could not be worked. I may observe in passing that the French have not shown themselves particularly obliging about any form of joint dealing, and I do not think it is their way to be so. There is possibility in the contention that the scene of action being where it is in northwest France and Belgium, it is simple to put the wounded on board ship at Channel Port, and this will no doubt have to be done with some place on our south coast in place of Marseille, and the disagreeable voyage to Egypt by Gibraltar in place of that by Sicily. I'm sorry, but there appears to be no better way through this particular jungle. When Britain proposed that a hospital for the Indian troops be set up in Orléans, the French observed that this would place a large strain on their railroads, suggesting that they be evacuated to Algeria or England. In all official correspondence, particularly in this text, wounded Indian soldiers sound like commodities, pushed from one location to another, refused by one government after another, an item in a place of official paper that has outlived its usefulness and is now a liability. It is important to read policies of imperial powers comparatively in the background of war to understand the full implications of colonial decision-making on the lives of the colonized. So while France refused the accommodation of wounded Indian soldiers from British colonies who were fighting in the Western Front from their hospitals and railroads, Indian soldiers from French colonies in India, as we understand now, like Chandernagore, who were part of the French army, received medical care and accommodation in French hospitals. Policies such as these highlight the inherent arbitrariness in colonial decision-making. A month later, Crewe regretted the circumstances that necessitated the requirements of formal reparative care for wounded Indian soldiers in Britain. He wrote to Hardinge again, noting, quote, "It's bad luck that we have been obliged to bring the Indian wounded to England at all, and I'm vexed about it. But there was absolutely no help for it, as our intended stages of southern France, Egypt, India, were made impossible by French unwillingness or inability to help in their share of the transaction," unquote. Crewe's tone here is much more desperate. However, his desperation stems not from his concern for the medical treatment of the wounded Indian soldiers, but out of a sense of exhaustion that all of their means to keep the latter out of Britain has failed. The letters exchanged in the early months of the war detail all kinds of possibilities to keep wounded Indian soldiers outside of Britain's borders. They consider all means to outsource the medical treatment of these wounded men fighting for them in their war. It is in this letter, dated 19th of November 1914, that they reach a finitude in their search to keep the Indians out. Crewe calls it their bad luck. He feels that provisioning medical care for wounded Indian soldiers is now their obligation, and his affective response to the situation is that of vexation. The obsession with keeping the racial other out of the border is certainly not new, and as we've noticed in recent times, still ongoing. A nation's borders are lines of separation, functioning to keep the other out. Their porosity, noticeable only to the privileged with the right paperwork and with the right skin tone. Historians have analyzed the particular brutality of colonial borders and the tremendous distance between the colony and the metropole. Nevertheless, Crewe's words here are particularly significant because they do not outline mere border control policies to keep the other out, but rather they outline the unwillingness of the necropolitical state to assume responsibility for the health and treatment of the colonized bodies they employ to fight their war. As more Indian soldiers get wounded in November 1914, the British government finally give in and sent a reluctant telegram to Surgeon General Sloggett of the Indian Corps instructing, quote, "Accommodate as many Indians as you can in France, send surplus to England with native personnel to look after them," unquote. Here too, the choice of words are insightful. The rhetoric of surplus is ingrained in the English society since early 19th century, when the decennial census of 1801 labeled some people as surplus or outside of ideal society and marked others as, quote, within that ideal society deserving of representation, unquote. By designating wounded Indian soldiers as surplus, the British government was already branding them as not ideal for British society. By the end of 1914, however, Walter Lawrence had established a number of hospitals for Indians in France and Britain. In France, large Indian hospitals were set up in Boulogne and Marseille, while smaller hospitals were established at Hardelot, Montreuil, Lilliers, and Savenot. In England, Lawrence acquired the Royal Pavilion, York Place Schools, and a block of buildings that eventually became the Kitchener Hospital, all in Brighton. This was followed by Lady Huttinge and Forest Park Hotel hospitals in Brockenhurst, as well as smaller hospitals in Netley, Bournemouth, and Milford-on-Sea, and a convalescent centre at Barton-on-Sea. Meanwhile, in its investigations of conditions in the Mesopotamian front, the Mesopotamian Commission highlighted how the principle of economizing at all costs resulted in dire consequences for wounded and sick Indian sepoys. Here's a quote from the Commission report. Under a policy so rigorously defined, it is not unnatural that military and medical officers thought that they were best discharging their duty to the government by keeping down demands, by carrying on as best as they could without incurring fresh expenditure, and by discouraging their subordinates from pressing new ideas or ideals which would entail additional expenditure. As Andrew Jarboe comments, the life of an Indian soldier was cheap. Austerity measures did not extend to British soldiers. Decisions related to austerity in military healthcare were taken by British officers, and they affected Indian soldiers the most. Reflecting on the extreme austerity measures affecting the access and quality of the healthcare of Indian soldiers, the Vincent Bingley Commission observed in 1916 that British officers thought, quote, A, that there is more merit to be obtained by keeping quiet and not worrying the higher authorities than by asking for what is necessary. B, that keeping down expenditure is more meritorious than efficiency. C, that nothing new is likely to be sanctioned unless a corresponding saving in something else can be shown. And D, that even in small matters, anything asked for will be cut down by half. A system of this nature will possibly be good and economical in peacetime, but is bound to break down in war. Each of these 4 points involves the power and liberty of making decisions that directly affect the possibility of life and death of a wounded or sick sepoy. By choosing to not place an order for essential medical supplies in order not to worry the higher authorities, the British officer systematically denied a wounded or sick Indian soldier reliant on that medical supply the opportunity to heal or recuperate. In doing so, the life and health of a wounded or sick soldier of color is deemed to be of less importance than the inconvenience of a white officer in charge. The hierarchy of inconvenience is interesting to observe. What for whiteness is administrative procedure, for a person of color, it is a matter of life and death. To have the power to make such decisions or expenditure is to have literal power over life and death, what Mbembe calls the, quote, sovereign right to kill, unquote. To implement such decisions on wounded and sick soldiers of color is to sentence them to disability and death, which simultaneously also means rendering these bodies incapable to be sent back to fight in the front. The confidence to implement such necropolitical decisions on life, death, and disablement stems from viewing black and brown bodies as inherently fungible. There is no sense of loss. They can be replaced. Meanwhile, the priorities in the Western Front were slightly different from that of the Mesopotamian Front, and hence the means and exercise of that power was different too. Mary Borden, the American nurse who ran a hospital near Flanders, noted in her book, The Forbidden Zone, quote, men should be broken and that they should be mended, unquote. Walter Lawrence, lay out the prerogative for Indian soldiers in more prosaic terms in his letter to Lord Kitchener when he says, quote, "The great preoccupation of the officers working in the Indian hospitals was to heal and render the men fit for the fighting line," unquote. A few days later, in a letter to Kitchener in March 1915, he would offer a precise statistic of the number of Indians returning to the front from the convalescent center, 57.48%. By June, the commander of the Kitchener Hospital had the precise numbers. Quote, "Out of 2,600 cases treated here, I have already returned 900 to duty, and every effort is made to get men out as quickly as possible," unquote. The numbers and statistics echo Borden's sharply satiric note, quote, "And we send our men to the war again and again, just as long as they will stand it, just until they are dead, and then we throw them to the ground." The next section is titled "Segregation as Appeasement, Running the Indian War Hospital." After his visit to Indian hospitals in Britain in March 1915, Walter Lawrence wrote to Hardinge, quote, "Everything that can be done is being done to scrupulously respect Indian prejudices and caste peculiarities." The measures included religious and caste segregated wards, baths, kitchens, toilet facilities, laundry services, and even water supplies. Lawrence was particularly proud of the complex organization around food preparation and segregation. Hospital kitchens were divided into separate sections to cater for Hindus, Muslims, and vegetarians. The food for patients of the same religion and caste was handled, cooked, and served by men of the same religion and caste. In keeping with the religious expectations of Hindus and Muslims, no beef or pork entered the hospital kitchens, and the slaughtering of animals and the storing of meat was also performed by butchers of the appropriate caste. At Brighton, there were 6 different kitchens catering to 8 different kinds of diets, segregated on the basis of religion and caste. In the same letter, Lawrence proclaimed, quote, "Every day I come across interesting little facts connected with the Indian customs," unquote. As his detailed letters over the next few months reveal, Lawrence went to utmost lengths to ensure that all these little facts connected with the Indian customs were implemented to the utmost precision. While it is possible to applaud what appears to be the thoughtfulness of the British colonial administration to ensure that Indian soldier patients were cared for in circumstances that appeared most familiar to their customs, I argue here that the British upholding of caste and religious segregation in war hospitals, particularly in France and Britain, served more insidious purposes. In my analysis, I'm indebted to theorists and historians of caste and colonialism like Periyar Ramaswamy, Bernard Cohn, Ronajit Guho, and Nicholas Dirks, among others. Walter Lawrence, through British military officers and war hospital administrators, was only exerting appropriate colonial governance in hospital settings made possible by 200 years of British imperialism's Orientalist studies of the customs of the other. Lawrence's daily encounters with new, quote-unquote, interesting little facts are part of his late lessons on colonial knowledge of Indianness that British colonial administrators learned in order to exert appropriate colonial governance. For them, defining Indianness seemed only possible to be achieved through caste discrimination. Dirk argues that colonial governance used caste as a measure of all social things, and that this was possible because caste was made one of the most important emblems of tradition. The Indian War Hospital became an important site to demonstrate colonial governance because large number of Indians spent empty hours together in a closed building with barricaded grounds to recuperate. So, using religion and caste as modes of segregation and control in this confined site allowed British administrators to demonstrate how well they were familiar with the customs and practices of their colonial subjects. Demonstrating this familiarity was particularly important as a means of appeasement for the recuperating Indian soldiers. This trope of appeasement through exercising colonial knowledge of religious and caste-based customs makes recurrent appearance in Lawrence's letters over the next few months, and I will come back to this shortly. Now, returning to the list of segregations in living and food arrangements in the hospitals, the pattern of arrangements follows what Bernard Cohen argued as reducing, quote, vastly complex codes and their associated meanings to a few metonyms, unquote. In the war hospital setting, that meant segregation of labor and food on the basis of religion and caste. The caste-based segregation was totalizing. For example, when the authorities began making provisions for the cremation or burial of soldiers who died at Indian hospitals in England, they made sure to employ men from the appropriate castes to carry out that work. Lawrence likewise elucidated how men from appropriate castes had been employed to sweep the hospital floors. Yet, just as the casteism of British colonial authorities was totalizing and pervasive, it was also uniform. The strain they had adopted was reducing Indian soldiers to their religion and caste. For the British colonial authorities, religion and caste comprised the totality of Indian ontology. Casteism in India is not a British invention. It is a history entrenched in blood and violence. Caste struggle is a centuries-long and ongoing political process. The employment of caste-based labor and segregation, however, at war hospital sites like Brockenhurst and Brighton, strips it of the context of political struggle while profiting from its violent history. And it is profit because the British colonial authorities believed that following religious and caste-based customs in these spaces made the colonial rule appear benevolent and thoughtful to the wounded and sick Indian soldiers. Lawrence noted to Kitchener, quote, "I will never lose an opportunity of impressing upon all those who are working in these hospitals that great political issues are involved in making the stay of the Indians in England as agreeable as possible," unquote. This tone of anxiety regarding appeasement runs throughout all the official correspondence circulated at this time. As Samuel Hyson and Alan Lester have noted, this anxiety and the need to appease Indian soldiers through familiar religious and caste-based customs stem from fearing a repeat of 1857. The Sepoy Revolt of 1857 is often considered the first war of Indian independence. One of the reasons for the revolt was a rumor that in order to load the new Enfield rifles, Sepoys had to bite the cartridges that were supposedly made of cow and pig fat, a taboo for both Hindus and Muslims. Therefore, by 1915, at the site of another war, Lawrence was careful to advertise the great lengths taken by the British colonial administration to maintain the religious and caste-based ideas of purity and avoid circumstances that would lead to discontentment among Indians in war hospitals and at home. Lawrence also spent a great deal of effort into micromanaging and controlling religious exposure in Indian hospitals. On a tour of Indian hospitals in Britain in February 1915, he discovered a non-Christian soldier in possession of a vernacular translation of the Gospel of St. Mark. Narrating this incident to Kitchener in a letter, he writes, quote, "I asked him where he had got it, and he said a lady had given it to him," unquote. Lawrence immediately launched into a thorough investigation to find out who this particular visitor was and revised existing hospital visit policies in Britain. Quote, "The question of visitors to the Indian hospitals has been very carefully considered, and I have been consulted on the subject by the India Office. Generally speaking, officers of the Indian Army are most welcome, and it has been arranged that ladies belonging to regiments of which men are in the hospital are also admitted. Everybody who visits the hospital is supposed to write their name in a book, and they will be shown a notice begging them not to take any books of religious nature," unquote. On further investigations, Lawrence found other vernacular translations of the Gospels at the Brighton Pavilion, and he assured Kitchener that he had given, quote, "orders that these should be strictly excluded," unquote. Lawrence wanted to make sure that there was no ambiguity regarding religious practices for Indian soldiers in the hospitals. Policing who could visit the premises and thus potentially carry other religious documents was one way to ensure that soldiers did not receive any unwelcome religious exposure. After this incident, Lawrence also made provisions to monitor the admittance of clergymen and missionaries to the hospitals. He noted to Kitchener that, quote, "We cannot be too careful," unquote, as if any attempt had been made to proselytize men who are sick or wounded, there would be great trouble. Once again, the strain of anxiety regarding religion and the need for appeasement at any cost appears in the documents. A month later, in March 1915, during his tours of Indian hospitals in France, Lawrence discovered that the YMCA had been in close touch with the Indians at certain hospitals. He wrote to Kitchener that, quote, "They have establishments at Rouen, Marseille, and Bordeaux. I have begged the officers commanding there to keep a very sharp eye on the proceedings of the YMCA and to prevent sepoys using YMCA paper with the inscription Christian Anjuman for their letters home. Many such letters have gone, and great capital will be made in India by agitators who are doing their utmost to cause the disaffection in our army," unquote. His anxiety seems quite great at this discovery, and his interaction with the officers at the hospitals reveals his desperation. It is nonetheless ironic to observe this stance regarding exposure to Christianity from a seasoned British colonial officer. After all, Christianity and the civilizing mission had been used as a justification for colonialism for centuries, and the very fact that gospel texts existed in vernacular languages, vernacular Indian languages, and that the YMCA had centers throughout British India only affirmed the success of the spread of Christianity in India. Lawrence's desperate bid to uphold what he understands as quote-unquote Indian customs at the sites of war hospitals in 1915 are merely superficial means of placating, recuperating Indian soldiers and affirming colonial governance. His final comment regarding the YMCA incident in France sums up the inherent hollowness behind these measures. Quote, "There are many outside waiting to seize and make political capital out of any error made in regard to caste and religious procedure," unquote. In his final report to Kitchener, written on the 8th of March 1916, Walter Lawrence announced, "Looking back on the experiences of the last year and a half, I think that on the whole, from a political point of view, the decision to bring the Indians to English hospitals has done more good than harm. I think that the work has been of some use. It has shown to the sick and wounded Indians in very strange circumstances that there was a personal interest in them. In some ways, they are children, but intensely proud, shrewd, and sensitive. They appreciated the message of goodwill." Lawrence sums up the work of his office by using classic racist tropes. Indian soldiers are infantilized even as they lie wounded or sick from having fought in a major war. Interestingly, in most of the cases, the soldiers that Lawrence infantilizes would be sent back to the front to fight again. He also stereotypes the soldiers using the same attributes that Said warns us about in Orientalism. According to Lawrence, every Indian soldier who was nursed in one of the Indian hospitals in Britain or France was proud, shrewd, and sensitive, while also being childlike, all attributes in direct opposition to a regular British Tommy. Lawrence also manages to shift the focus away from healing and recovery to goodwill and impressions created by the British government. He continues, quote, "Of one thing I am sure, that it was a wise policy, considering the political condition of India, to bring Indian troops to Europe. They have left France with a profound respect for the British soldier and for British resources. They go back deeply impressed with the mechanical side of warfare. They talk with insight about the various natures of guns and contrivances employed in trench fighting. It has been an education to them." The infantilizing tone towards Indian soldiers continues even as British prestige takes center stage. he turns participation into a teachable moment, not just through the actual experience of warfare in Europe, but also through the opportunity of spectacle. Lawrence believed that allowing Indian soldiers to come to Europe enabled them to see the imperial power of Britain in all its might, whether through infrastructure, as demonstrated in the hospitals they were treated, or through the display of mechanized warfare. He highlights the subservience of the Indian soldier by affirming that the latter would leave Europe with a profound respect for the British. Ultimately, for Lawrence, the subservience of the Indian soldier is intertwined with his ignorance or naivete, which is why he believes that fighting a brutal war in another continent has been an education for the Indian soldier. This assumption about the higher British prestige during the war is made by all of these men of power. In the same year, Hardinge wrote to Lawrence that, quote, "The work done in the Indian hospitals in England and France tends to increase our prestige in this country and also the attachment the lower classes have to the Sarkar," meaning government, unquote. The classism in his sentence is striking, and this at once clarifies the reasonings behind the elaborate administrative policies of the Indian hospitals. It was not out of concern for the wounded Indian soldier in unfamiliar surroundings that the colonial administration replicated familiar religious and caste customs. It was to ensure that the soldiers appreciated the gestures of the colonial government and returned to India with a renewed sense of devotion to the colonial state. In all the letters that they censored from the hospitals, in all the conversations in convalescent beds that they eavesdropped, in all of the dialogues that they generated with sick and wounded Indian soldiers, each of these powerful men obsessively searched for, quote, "loyal spirits and gratitude," unquote. The prevalence of these two feelings among Indian soldier patients becomes the currency by which these men of power estimate the success of their care program. Ultimately, for wounded and sick Indian soldiers in hospitals, gratitude becomes a racial affect. It is regularly demanded by the colonial authorities. The soldier patients regularly need to profess their feelings of gratitude, and the varied ways in which they are made to profess gratitude are captured in official correspondence and exchanged in letters between these men of power. Gratitude becomes a collectively experienced structure that the wounded and sick Indian soldiers have to simultaneously perform for being granted a bed and care in a hospital in England or France. I would like to end here today, not with a resolution or an answer, but with a gesture towards more thinking. In what ways does the racial affect of gratitude continue to dictate the imperial state's expectations of subservience from the marginalized? Thank you.